History is pretty daft, and history doesn't often get weirder than a newly appointed God-ordained monarch deciding to execute a corpse to avenge his dead dad. Meet Charles II. It's the 29th of May, 1660. Charles is having a good day. In fact, he's having the best day, as it's not only his 30th birthday, but his birthday present is the entire kingdom of England and Scotland.
Ha-ha! Get in!
Charles immediately set to work on organising everything a new king of the kingdom would need to do to run his new domain, that being to host one huge party. Upon his arrival to London, Charles II paraded through the streets in a procession from the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey, which took over 5 hours due to the size of the crowds and celebrations. Wine was put in the public fountains to flow as free as water, and Charles was even given a gift of £10,000 from the City of London's council. That's £1.7 million today. However, you may be surprised to know that after hosting the mother of all parties, and then surviving the mother of all hangovers, rather than turning his attention to other stately duties like being coronated or getting married, or even having another party, Charles instead turned his heart to revenge. But to explain any further, we have to go even further back in time. Meet Charles I, Charles II's dad, and he's having a bad day. In fact, he's having the worst day, as he's about to be executed. Charles has found himself on the losing end of a civil war that has raged since 1642. And now, on the bitterly cold 30th of January 1649, Charles found himself shivering before the executioner's block. Now, to be fair, Charles was a pretty awful king, having abused his country by squeezing it for every last coin and copper it had, and spent all those ill-gotten gains on luxuries like paintings and palaces, and particularly fancy jewel-encrusted shoes. The problem was that, according to Charles, he was being unfairly forced to listen to this bunch of party poopers called Parliament, who were supposed to help him run the country, but their advice seemed pretty boring and awful. For example, they kept complaining how it was unlawful to just do whatever you want, and actually arresting everyone you don't like was against the rules. Despite Charles's insistence that he was a godly appointed monarch and could cite the ancient law of "I can do whatever I want," Parliament was having none of it, and eventually even started to gather up armies in open revolt. What followed was the English Civil War. It was long, bloody, and annoyingly rather complicated, but the key thing to note was that by its end, approximately 200,000 people, nearly 5% of the entire population of England, had dropped dead. And since Charles lost, those 200,000 bodies were placed directly at Charles's jewel-encrusted feet. In fact, Charles was so despised at this point that one particularly grumpy parliamentarian called Oliver Cromwell decided the very idea of having a king was absolute rubbish. After convincing Parliament to agree with him, mainly by throwing out anyone who disagreed and threatening to stab them with particularly pointy swords, he managed to get Parliament to put Charles on trial and eventually have the Man of Blood, as they dubbed him, executed, with over 50 jurors of the trial signing his death warrant. As a result, Charles was beheaded. But the King of England had no longer a king, so who was going to be in charge now? And what title were they going to have? Enter Cromwell. Cromwell would go on to rule England not as king, but under the title of Lord Protector, which is obviously completely different to being a king. Despite the fact he stayed in the king's royal palaces, wore purple, the royal colour of kings, and ruled with absolute authority without listening to Parliament. Even the very name of the country had to change too, as you can't exactly be a kingdom without a king, so England now became the Commonwealth of England. Cromwell's rule would be utterly reviled as he forced the country to fit with his strict extremist views on Protestantism, which was called Puritanism. Ball games on Sundays were banned, those who swore faced fines and even prison time, and even Christmas itself was banned too. However, worst of all was Cromwell's brutal conquest of his enemies, particularly in Ireland, where his invasion killed nearly 40% of the population. It's no wonder then that most of the British Isles would have probably breathed a sigh of relief when Cromwell finally snuffed it, thanks to a 1-2 punch of malaria and kidney stones. Oliver's son, Richard Cromwell, attempted to take the reins as the second Lord Protector, but he was quickly dismissed by the army and replaced by Parliament, who all agreed that maybe having that tyrant with the fancy shoes wasn't actually so bad as the alternative. As a result, Parliament turned to Charles's surviving son, Charles II, who had been hiding out in the Netherlands after one aborted attempt to invade England from landing in Scotland had ended in disaster and was personally stopped by Oliver Cromwell himself. Therefore, after Charles II signed a big fancy document called the Declaration of Breda, promising to not be as cruel as his father, actually listen to Parliament, and promised those who fought against his father during the Civil War wouldn't be killed, he was welcomed back to England in triumph. Yet, although Charles had promised to pardon all those who fought against his father, he still had a grudge to bear. Some of his father's murderers, the 50 who signed the death warrant to kill Charles I, were still alive. They had committed the worst crime against a king imaginable, regicide, the murder of a divinely appointed monarch, a crime which not only blatantly ignored the law of England, but even the laws of God himself. Worst of all, Cromwell, his rival, the one who had stopped his father, destroyed his kingdom, and had personally stopped his reinvasion of England, had gone unpunished. In fact, his body had been buried with all the honours of a king and was still in Westminster Abbey, lying beside Charles II's royal ancestors. This could not stand. And so, in January 1661, Charles was able to easily convince Parliament, who were all too ready to give up their links with Cromwell, to finally dig up Cromwell's body and give it what it deserved. Parliament ordered that alongside Cromwell's body, that 2 other bodies should also be dug up. John Bradshaw, the leader of the trial against Charles I, and Henry Ireton, a key parliamentarian general and Cromwell's son-in-law. On the 30th of January 1661, 12 years to the day after Charles I's own death, their bodies were hanged by chains from the neck on Tyburn Hill, where traitors and criminals had been killed since 1196. Then, as the sun began to set, to really stick it to these dead corpses, their bodies were taken down and beheaded. Their heads were placed on pikes and stuck on the Palace of Westminster, where Charles I himself had been put on trial. The heads, or what was left of them, were then left to rot for 23 years until 1684, when it was then knocked down by a storm, much to the relief of all the commuters who had to go past Westminster each day. Now, it may seem rather weird to get your own back for your dad by mutilating a dead body, but there was actually a degree of logic to all this. First and foremost, it was a symbolic gesture. Obviously, no one thought Cromwell was actually getting hurt by having his dead body's head lobbed off. But Charles II was able to, in one simple but grisly message, make clear that anyone who went against him and his royal Stuart family would face the consequences, even when they are 6 feet under. Furthermore, it was a common belief in this period that you could only ascend to heaven on Judgment Day if your body was still intact, something the very devout Cromwell would have believed very dearly. This therefore meant Cromwell's eternal soul was now potentially doomed. Charles II's reign would go on to be eventful to say the least. It would be marked by successes and failures, from starting one of the oldest scientific societies in the world, the Royal Society, having more parties and mistresses than the records could even keep track of, to surviving the hell of London itself when it burst into flames in the Great Fire of London in 1666. Therefore, the death of Cromwell has become a forgotten grisly afterthought to one of England's most fashionable kings. But it still doesn't make it any less weird that Charles II began his reign by executing a corpse. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to see even more utterly bizarre moments from history poorly animated by me, then be bold and click that proud red subscribe button just below this video. Go on, do it. It's there, waiting for you. Greatness is mere moments away. And while you're at it, why don't you click that little bell next to it? Then you'll actually know when I make a video. Why?